Hello everybody, and welcome to the webinar on regulatory affairs for QPs and QA feature. You can send, if you've got a question at any time, you can use the chat feature to send a question, and if there is a chance at the end, I will answer as many questions as possible. So let me just explain who I am, a little bit about my background. I describe myself these days as a former analytical chemist. I did start out as an analytical chemist and spent about 12 years in a QC lab in a pharmaceutical company, which was Eli Lilly. And I spent over 30 years working for Eli Lilly, primarily in the UK, but in my last few years I had a global role. I've been a qualified person since 1985, so over 30 years now, and I've also been a QP assessor and chairman of the Royal Society of Chemistry's QP assessor panel. And since leaving Lilly, I've been now 13 years as an executive director at NSF Health Sciences. So that's a little bit about my background. So what I intend to cover on this webinar is, I hope by the end of the webinar, you'll be able to understand and explain to others what your regulatory affairs colleagues do, how this impacts on the role of the QP and the QA people that support the QP. So we'll be looking at the content and structure of marketing authorizations. We'll be looking at variations, including the new draft of ICH Q12, a little bit about the impact of Brexit, and why mutual understanding and communication between Reg Affairs and QPs and QA, frankly, is essential to maintain compliance with marketing authorizations and other authorizations. It could also, I will mainly talk about marketing authorizations, but for those of you in the investigational products world, you can simply substitute clinical trial authorization and product specification file for marketing authorization. So what does Reg Affairs do? Well, they are the group of people within most companies, pharmaceutical companies, who have the responsibility for handling the communications between the company and regulatory authorities. Much of that is written, but it can be verbal at times as well. So Reg Affairs compile, submit, manage all of your authorizations, so clinical trial authorizations, marketing authorizations, manufacturing import authorizations, and wholesale authorizations. All of those have to be applied for. Sometimes when you apply for them, you get questions. Certainly with marketing authorization, you invariably get questions. And then having got the authorization, you have to maintain them. And that's maybe responding to providing updates. It may be varying and changing the authorization over time. So that's what your Reg Affairs people do, and they are the expert in your companies in those interactions with the regulatory authorities. So why is it that what Reg Affairs does is critical for QPs and QA? Well, it's quite simple. The QP has a legal duty to certify that batches are in compliance with either the CTA and PSF for investigational products or the marketing authorization for marketed products. And that was spelt out very clearly and re-emphasized, as well as being in the law, of course, in the new version of Annex 16 that came out just a couple of years ago now. So it made it very clear that if the QP is responsible for providing confirmation of compliance for those operations with the relevant marketing authorization, then the QP should have access to the necessary details. And that is should be self-evident, but certainly in my experience auditing, it is not always the case. So QPs need to know what is in the latest version of the marketing authorization for marketed products. Frankly, in the IMP world, in the investigational world, you've got to also keep up with what's in the CTA and the product specification file, and that's even more of a challenge because it's changing probably even more frequently than a marketing authorization. And that's often one of the biggest issues. And I've lost count of the number of companies I know who've got themselves into trouble with regulatory authorities because when the authorities come in, they find that the QP is releasing against what may be sometime a years old version of the marketing authorization and is not the current version. Because marketing authorizations have to be maintained and varied, and so QPs and QA departments that support them need to be looped into that process. And clearly, for that, there needs to be a good communication channel between Reg Affairs and the QP and QA. So, QPs and QA, therefore, need to have an understanding of the structure and format of marketing authorizations, and in many parts of the world now that is harmonized in what's called the Common Technical Document. I'll say more about that in a minute. I'm going to focus primarily, exclusively on the European position. So if you're releasing product as a QP in Europe, you need to understand what type of license it is and how it's been obtained, because that can impact some of your decision making. You need to understand the mechanisms for varying authorizations. They can be varied because something wants to change in manufacturing. They can be varied by the authorities, so you need to understand the different routes. And latterly, I'll talk about the potential impacts of Brexit. So in Europe, America, and Japan, and in many other countries now, the format of a marketing authorization is harmonized into what's called the Common Technical Document, or CTD. Its development started way back in 1995 as part of the ICH process, and the first version was finalized in November 2000, so it's been with us for 18 years, well, just over 17 years now. And it's ICH M4. It's a multidisciplinary guideline because it covers quality, safety, and efficacy. And since 2002, there's been a whole series of sub-documents published. There is what's called the eCTD as well, electronic version. In the EU, it was optional to use the CTD since July 2003, but it's now mandatory certainly in the EU and the US. And as I mentioned just now, there's an electronic version, the eCTD, which is M8 of ICH, and now certainly in the EU and the USA, it is mandatory to use the electronic version and submit marketing authorizations electronically rather than submitting truckloads of paper. The CTD lays down the structure and format for the application. There are still differences around the world in actually what is expected by different authorities for the content, but at least the structure and the format is harmonized. At the top of the pyramid here, Module 1 is where you put any bits that are not harmonized in terms of the structure and are regional specific. For instance, in Europe, the Europeans still require an expert report. Because that is solely a European requirement, it would go in Module 1. Module 2 is all about the summaries. Module 2 is summaries of the other modules. So modules 3, 4, and 5 is where the bulk of the submission lies, and Module 2 is all about the summaries of each of those. So Module 1, as I say, is regional specific information, and that's what in Europe it would be the expert report. If you move on then to Module 2, it's summaries of the overall package. Module 3 and is the quality, and Module 2.3 is the quality overall summary. So that is usually a good starting point for a QP or QA to look at what are the important bits for me when I'm certifying a batch of products. You'll find emphasis on what are the critical quality attributes and the critical process parameters. It provides justifications if other guidelines have not been followed, and it discusses the key issues for this particular product. And the module where all of the detail that a QP and QA need to be aware of is Module 2. And please note, in ICH terminology, they use the term drug substance to replace active pharmaceutical ingredient, whereas probably in industry we still, by and large, use the term API in a day-to-day basis. But from a regulatory point of view, it talks about drug products, which is the product, and drug substances, which is the API. And this is the module that contains the details that the QP needs to know. It talks about, for both the product and the API, how you make it and how you test it. So they're the key commitments within a marketing authorization as far as the QP is concerned, who is certifying that the batch has been manufactured and tested in accordance with what is in the marketing authorization. This is where you find out what is in that bit of the marketing authorization. By and large, probably the QPs and QA don't need to get too involved with modules 4 and 5. Module 4 is about safety, so pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, toxicology. Maybe in terms of cleaning validation limits, there might be some interest there. And module 5 is all about efficacy. That's where all your clinical study reports go and all your literature references. So that's where you look. In module 3, that's what the QP needs to know. How you know about it is entirely up to you within an organization. You can actually obviously have a physical copy of it, or you could have an internal mechanism to keep you appraised of what is in there and how it's being varied. In terms of how you obtain in Europe a marketing authorization, there are 4 possible routes, and I will go through each of those routes in turn. The centralized procedure is a single authorization valid across the whole of the EU, so currently all 28 member states. It is compulsory for some types of product, biotechnology products, orphan medicinal products, new chemical entities indicating for AIDS, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, and advanced therapy medicinal products. So for all of those, you don't get a choice. You have to put it through the centralized route. And the centralized procedure is by and large used for all the high-tech things. It's also used for pediatric marketing authorizations, but it's optional for those. In the US, of course, you have the registration dossier. It's called an NDA or an NADA if it's an animal drug. You have an ANDA, abbreviated if it's for an existing chemical entity. In other words, a generic version of something that's already on the market, and a BLA for biologic license applications. It is a little bit more complicated applying in the US because you have to decide, are you going to go for an NDA or a BLA if it's a new chemical entity. So getting a marketing authorization is a complicated business. It can take many, many months, years sometimes, to get the marketing authorization reviewed and approved. There will be a to and a fro process. The regulatory affairs people will put it together in the first place. And my advice to any QPs is, if you know there's a new chemical entity coming on board and Reg Affairs are compiling a marketing authorization, get involved at that point, because whatever goes into that marketing authorization, you are going to have to ensure compliance with moving forward if and when it's granted. So my strong advice to QPs is get involved with what goes into the marketing authorization up front, because you're going to have to live with whatever is put in there. Having got a marketing authorization, unfortunately, nothing ever stays the same. You then end up having to change it. And fortunately, when looking at the EU and the USA, although they call them slightly different things, the categorization of variations has actually been harmonized. There's what's called prior approval. In other words, you have to ask permission from the regulatory authorities before you go ahead and implement a change. In the EU, that's called a Type 2 variation. Then there's a number of mechanisms where you have to notify the authorities, but you may well be able to go ahead and make the change even without a response from the authorities. So in the EU, the default variation is a Type 1B. In America, that's equivalent to what's called a CBE 30, the CBE standing for changes being effected. In other words, you notify the authorities you want to make a change, you wait 30 days, and if you've not heard any objections or had any response from the authorities, you can go ahead and implement the change. The next one down in Europe would be a 1AIN, and that is where you notify the authorities and you can immediately make the change. In America, that's called a CBE 0. And then the final one in Europe is a 1A. In America, that's the annual submission, and that's where you make all the changes in a year, and once a year, you just send them a list of the changes you have made during that year. Some changes you may not need to tell the authorities at all. And this is where it can get complicated, trying to work out which changes do you need to tell the authorities about and which changes don't you. Because if you don't, you just merely need to document that within your product quality system as part of your change control process and manage it internally. It will obviously be then subject to inspection by GMP inspectors, but you don't have to tell the authorities at all. The problem comes is deciding, well, which type of change have I got? And again, this is where the QP is likely to have to consult their Reg Affairs department, because they are the expert in what needs to be told to the authorities, what type of variation is it, and to make sure that it is submitted. And clearly then there needs to be dialogue between the Reg Affairs people and the QP. We don't know who will be issuing. A number of people can initiate a variation. It could be the authorities initiating a variation if it's a safety change on your leaflet, for instance. It might be the company wants to change their manufacturing process slightly, introduce a new piece of kit, change their testing processes in the lab, whatever. So as part of your internal change control process, the QP needs to make sure that Reg Affairs are aware of changes and are taking a view as to whether a submission needs to be made to the regulatory authorities or not, or whether you can handle it. And obviously when submissions are made and licenses are varied and changed, there is a process to be followed. The QP needs to be kept up to date. Sometimes there's an implementation period. You might have a period of, say, if you're changing a carton or something, you might have a period where you're allowed to have both versions over a short period so that you can use up old stock. All of that needs to be communicated to the QP so that they are ensuring that when they're certifying product as being in compliance with the marketing authorization, it is actually in compliance with the latest version of that marketing authorization. Now, one of the current changes that's going to occur, and not happened yet, it's not finalized yet, is helping you decide what sort of change do you need to submit. And this is being handled by another ICH document, ICH Q12. And it is, again, trying to harmonize approaches to post-approval changes. The expert working group started work in November 2014, and 3 years later, just November last year, we got a draft, what's called a Step 2 draft, approved, and it's been circulated now for approval. So if you've not seen it, you can go onto the ICH website, which is just ich.org, and have a look and download that. It's got a 12-month review period, which is longer than usual. Normally, ICH documents most typically would have a 6-month review. And one of the reasons for that is the EU's got a problem with one section of it on established conditions, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. It is very disappointing that the EU only raised the fact that they might not be able to follow some of what's been written in June 2017, when everybody had been working on it for nearly 3 years. Suddenly the Europeans woke up and decided they might have a problem with it, which I don't think pleased anybody and certainly hasn't pleased the European industry. So Q12 fits with ICH Q8 and Q11, which I hope you're all aware is ICH Q8 is about how you develop your product, and ICH Q11 is all about how you develop your drug substance, the API. That's what you put in your initial regulatory filing to obtain a marketing authorization. So all of that's about the upfront stuff. Q12 then, he said, right, we've got a marketing authorization, we're into the commercialization phase. We need to obviously manage post-approval changes, and that's what Q12 is all about. And one of the key concepts that's in Q12 is this idea of established conditions. What is it in your marketing authorization application that amounts to a commitment to the government, is a contract between yourselves and the regulatory authority? In other words, if you're outside of that commitment, the QP should not be able to certify the batch because it would not be in compliance with its marketing authorization. The problem is, when I first became a QP 30 years ago, it was fairly simple, reasonably simple, to ascertain what were commitments. But over the last 30 years, the amount of detail you've had to put into a marketing authorization application has grown exponentially. So now it's more difficult to determine, well, what in that submission is merely there to explain to the authorities how you've got to the product and the process and the testing that you've got to, and what actually does constitute a commitment that if you go outside of that, you would be outside of your marketing authorization, and therefore the QP should not certify it. So this concept was first introduced by the Americans, actually, prior to Q12 draft starting, and has been taken into Q12. And the idea is it's an established condition if it's either a critical process parameter, which is a term I hope everybody's familiar with because it comes from Q8 and Q11. Q8 and Q11 talk about establishing critical quality attributes and critical process parameters. But Q12 introduces a new term, a key process parameter. One that a critical process parameter is critical because it has the potential to impact a critical quality attribute. A KPP is one that is important but doesn't actually directly impact a critical quality attribute, but does need to be controlled to assure product and process consistency. And unfortunately, this is the concept that the Europeans at the very last minute, at the 11th hour, decided probably wasn't compatible with current European legislation. They turned it over to the lawyers in June, and the lawyers came back in September and said, well, yes, we might have a problem. So the draft of Q12 at the moment has a get-out clause for Europe, which would be very disappointing because, frankly, there's no point in harmonizing if you don't harmonize. If Europe can't participate in parts of Q12, it really totally undermines the whole need for and the reason for having it. But maybe, just maybe, in the extra extended 12-month review period, perhaps the Europeans will come up with a workaround or possibly even a slight change to the law if deemed necessary. Because the reason it's so important to work out whether it's an established condition or not is if it is, then you've got to, in some way, shape or form, report it to the authorities. If it's, and the reporting level will depend on risk. If it's a high-risk change, it's likely that you're going to have to go down the prior approval route. In other words, you have to ask the authorities and then wait for their permission before you implement the change. If it's a moderate to low priority, then you can probably go down one of the various notification routes, 1A, 1IA, AIN, 1B, and really notify the authorities. And then if it's not an established condition, you don't report it, you merely manage it within your own internal quality system. So this is key to the working of Q12, and if the Europeans can't participate, it would be very disappointing. So I just want to move on now and talk about potential impacts of Brexit. The UK MHRA have been a very active regulatory authority within Europe, and it does mean that the UK has been the rapporteur member state for a disproportionate number of the centrally authorized products that are currently on the market. Well over 100 products have the UK as the rapporteur country. Once we leave the EU, then we won't be a member of the EU, we'll be a third country, and therefore we will not be able to be the rapporteur country for those marketing authorizations, and they will have to be varied to transfer them to another legal entity within the European Union, within one of the other 27 member states. So that means there's going to be a lot of work for your reg affairs people, and QPs definitely need to be aware of this because if it hasn't happened, the EMA have made it clear then product shouldn't be able to be certified. So that needs to, that mechanism needs to happen. It won't happen overnight. Also, of course, product needs to be certified in the EU. It means that QPs in the UK will still be able to certify product for the UK, but will no longer be able to certify product for the rest of the EU. And so product coming from the UK into the EU would need to be re-QP certified. And unless we get an MRA, may need retesting. So there is guidance published by the EMA that centrally authorised MA holders need to act before the UK leaves. At the moment, we don't know whether, at the moment, the leaving date is end of March next year, 2019, but where everybody is hoping we will get an implementation period, so that date may be kicked back by, hopefully, at least a couple of years. But nothing is certain yet. It is all still up for negotiation. There is a dedicated web page. EMA has a dedicated web page with question and answers around this. Now, the other thing is the other routes, the decentralised and the mutual recognition agreement. Again, the UK has been very often what's called the reference member state. And again, that if the UK, if you have a license that is either a decentralised license or a license that has gone through the mutual recognition route, and the UK was the first country you got the license in, the so-called reference member state, you would need then to transfer that reference member state to be another country within Europe. Usually it would be one of the concerned member states. So that's going to be a big change. So frankly, unless your product license is solely a UK national license, if you are making product that goes anywhere else in Europe, you are likely to have to make license changes if and check them if the UK has been either the rapporteur for centrally authorised products or the UK is the reference member state for decentralised or mutual recognition. You are going to need to submit license variations before the UK formally leaves the EU and becomes a third country. So that's going to be an awful lot of work and is going to require good communications again between your Reg Affairs people and the QP. It's going to be quite a challenge because some of these times, certainly for the centrally authorised product, it's going to be the EMA that you need to apply to. And of course the EMA at the moment is wrestling with not only all of this extra work, but the fact that they've got to move from London to Amsterdam. And anybody who's tried to move a large organisation will know that that's not something that happens easily and is likely to be quite disruptive. So there's going to be a huge amount of pressure on the EMA and the licensing sections within other regulatory authorities to get all of these license changes through in time, because nobody wants to impact on the actual sale and supply of medicines. But if the license changes haven't been made, that is what potentially might happen. So, just to summarise, one of the keys to an effective operation is that there must be effective communications between Reg Affairs and the QP and QA. A site's product quality system must cover Reg Affairs, and so you need procedures and you need to formalise the arrangements for communication between Reg Affairs and QPs. How you accomplish it is up to you. It can be paper, it could be an electronic system, but there has to be an effective system because QPs must know what is in the quality section of the marketing authorisation and keep up to date with changes and variations. And your change control processes within your product quality system have got to make sure that Reg Affairs are looped into that change process because they are the experts on whether or not you do need to submit a variation, and they need to communicate to everybody what the status of any variation submission is. So that's a brief overview of why Reg Affairs are so important for QPs. In Manchester in March this year, I'll be providing my normal pharmaceutical law update, and this year for the first time, for 2 days following that, we have some workshops, and we're describing them as workshops, not training courses. It's where we provide some information, but you can come along and ask all sorts of questions on these subjects, and we'll have myself and a Reg Affairs expert there, Helen Irwood, who will provide the Reg Affairs input to these discussions. So Wednesday the 21st of March is all about marketing authorizations, how you apply for them and what you put in them. And then the following day on Thursday, we'll talk all about variations, when you submit them, how you submit them, and when you need to submit them. So if you want to know more on this subject, please have a look on our website and sign up for those courses and the workshops, because they are booking up quite fast. So please get in to avoid disappointment, as they say. Okay, so thank you for taking an interest in this subject. If anybody's got any questions, please use the chat now and pose a question. I see somebody saying, "Oh, what is decentralized and what is MRP?" A decentralized process is where you apply through the EMA, but not to every member state. You merely apply to a subset. So if you just wanted to apply to, say, 10 or 12 member states, you would apply to 10 or 12 member states, but not all of them. And that's called the decentralized process. MRP, the mutual recognition procedure, is where you apply first in one member state for a national license, and then having obtained that, you say to other member states, I've got a national license in this country, therefore you can give me one in your country, can't you? And that's called the mutual recognition procedure. And as I said, the UK has been disproportionately a reference member state because they've been one of the initial countries of choice for national marketing authorizations. Okay, I can't see any more questions, so at that point I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope to see some of you for some of our courses and possibly even at the workshops in March, and thank you for your attention. If you want any questions, please email me at the email address given on the screen, and I'll leave that on the screen for a little while. Thank you.